Let's take a look at the history of human services. And I warn you, it's not a pretty story. The thing to realize is there have always been people in need, but they have been treated very differently over different times. So, why? What factors influenced how people in need were going to be treated? They often had the same problems as hundreds of years before, but why are they treated the way they are? So we're going to look through different cases through different historical lenses, different times. And this is the key concept I hope you will take away from this class. Human services are determined by two things. Number one, the definition of the problem. Whose fault is it that this problem exists? And how much resources, how much money society is willing to spend on services. This is the most important thing. A service will be determined by how people think what causes the problem and how much they're willing to spend on it. So what do we mean definition of the problem? So let's think about some of the things that people say are the reasons that teenagers are in trouble with the law. They might say, oh, it's poor parenting. No, it's poor schools. Now, it's a lack of strong communities. It's a lack of services. It's genetics. There are bad neighborhoods. They don't have morals. There's drugs. It's because of racism. I'm sure you would not have to travel far to find people who believe that any of these are the reasons teens are in trouble with the law. What you think is the cause of the problem is going to determine what you think will fix the problem. So, if we think the problem of children in teenagers in the court system is poor parenting, then maybe you remove children from homes. If you think the problem is poor schools, maybe you spend more money on the schools. If you think the problem is a lack of strong communities, maybe you find community leaders to help, or you just encourage people to move to different communities. If you think that teens are in trouble with the law because they lack community services, maybe you fund more services. If you think that teens are in trouble because they live in bad neighborhoods, maybe you just tear down those neighborhoods. Think about urban renewal of the 60s. If you think the problem is these teens don't have morals, you fund programs to teach morals. If you think the problem is drugs, perhaps you start the war on drugs and arrest vast numbers of people engaged in any kind of drug activity. And if you think the problem is racism, then you may work to seek to overhaul the system. Now, no matter what, throughout history, society has recognized that there are certain groups of people who absolutely need help. The mentally disabled, the physically sick, orphans and foundlings, people out of work, widows. But that help has looked very different at different times. Way back in the Middle Ages, the medieval time, in Europe, the Catholic Church was the main provider of human services. And it was understood that mental illness was caused because a demon had entered the person's brain. So what would be the cure? Well, you got to get the demon out of the person by making it as uncomfortable for the demon as possible. You would chain the person, starve them, beat them, and even something called tree pinning, which was literally cutting a hole in the skull to let the demon out. It made sense if you thought that caused the problem. This was a sensible way to get rid of the problem. Now, also, besides the church, feudal lords were supposed to care for the needy on their estates. Well, how well they did that depended entirely on the individual. And the church was supposed to care for the poor. All the residents of a local parish were required to pay a tax called a tithe. So how might services be affected by people's willingness to pay that tax, by the feudal lord's willingness to pay that tax, by the church's willingness to spend the money? Now, moving up from the 1500s through the 1600s, the power of the church and feudal lords began to decline, and the role of government increased to manage services. Now, the government is the king still at this point, and it was considered his responsibility to care for people with mental limitations. Now, of course, at the same time, the king could also take all the revenue if that person owned any land. So we've got a little conflict of interest already. And they began to build some kinds of institutions like orphanages and hospitals. And interestingly, in the beginning, hospitals not only provided medical care, such as they had at the time, but it was also a place for travelers to rest. So when you think of the word hospitality, which we think of as like hotels, motels, restaurants, and the word hospital, they have the same root because they used to do both. Institutions were also developed as homes to care for the elderly and the poor, as well as homes for people with mental illness called insane asylums. And then times continued to change, and it became beginnings of industry and factories, huge changes across the landscape. Thousands of people began to move to cities from the countryside to find work or better work. And at the same time, in England at least, the king took over the church, that's Henry VIII, and enacted what's called the Poor Laws in 1601. Now, this is really important, not so much even for what the law said, because it's the first time in history that the government took responsibility and wrote laws about how the needy were to be cared for. Theoretically, it was no longer up to the feelings or the whim of any particular person. These were established laws. People were classified by their ability to work. So children, poor children, orphaned children, were apprenticed, taught to learn a trade by working with a tradesman and living and working in the tradesman's own home. If you were considered able-bodied, if they decided there was nothing wrong with your body or your mind, you were just forced to work or you'd be punished. And if you were determined to be disabled, you were supposed to be cared for in your home or in an institution. And the laws now said who was responsible for, i.e., who would pay for which persons in need of assistance. The family was expected by law to provide for its members, but if it couldn't, then it was clearly the government's responsibility to care. And everyone had to pay a compulsory tax to pay for this service. And we know how people always feel about taxes. So let's move into colonial America now. And in the beginning, people relied on their neighbors when it was just a few Europeans. And I am going to pause here to say that from this point on, for several hundred years, I'm only talking about the perceived needs and care for white people, because Black people were almost completely enslaved with no legal protections or any assumptions about their rights. As cities grew, as more and more people, Europeans, came into colonial America, the number of people in need grew as well. And the colonies were English, so they followed the same English poor laws we talked about. Relief for the poor was a public responsibility. And where the person lived, the person in need was residing, known as their parish, would determine who was supposed to help them, and who was responsible, family members, grandparents, etc. And again, just like in England, children in need were to be apprenticed. At the same time, institutions were also developed. We began the creation of almshouses, houses for the poor, persons with mental illness, the elderly, children in need, and orphanages, the poor, the disabled, and even criminals. Institutions began being built in America for people with all of these perceived needs. By the 1800s, there were too many people for the local parishes to care for, or people in the local parishes didn't want to pay anymore. So states began building larger institutions, the state institutions, workhouses, etc. Now, in the 1800s, it was also a time of enormous change. Some of this was for better, and some of it was worse. So what changed in the 1800s? There was a massive, unprecedented amount of immigration coming from Europe primarily, a huge industrialization, the same as happened in England, with new factories being built and people moving off the farms into factory work. Cities were growing enormously, far more than there was any housing or services available. So think about what kind of problems would these changes cause. Huge numbers of poor people arriving without any connections or English, huge new factories being built, huge cities being overwhelmed by people. And so how did laws about the poor change during this time? People began to view poverty as being the fault of the person, that it was their fault. If they wanted to work, they wouldn't be poor. And so they wanted to keep limiting who could receive help, even as the numbers of people who were in need kept increasing. And people began to feel that any assistance provided should be less than the least amount that the person could have earned by working. The idea behind it being that people should work, and if they were poor, it was because they didn't want to work. So they should never get more by being poor than they could by working, regardless of what was the cause. And there were two new philosophies that justified these very, very difficult things. One was called laissez-faire, which is a French word, an economic philosophy that means leave alone. And that means that the government should not get involved in providing for the poor, not their role. The other was called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin's theory of evolution, the part of it around survival of the fittest, had nothing to do with this, but people took the idea that if you looked at species of animals and plants over thousands of years, those that could survive best in their environment were considered the fittest, and they would survive while other types of species died out or changed. Okay, he had never talked about what that meant for people, but various social philosophers, economists of the time said, oh yeah, well, that's the same as for people as well. Only those who can survive in our modern world, who can earn their own way and not die of starvation or poor housing, they're the fittest. They should survive. If they were too disabled to work, too poor to survive, we shouldn't be helping them. They shouldn't exist. They should die off, honest to God. So this led to some deeply horrific things like huge numbers of forced sterilizations of people either too poor or considered unfit. Immigrants were turned away at the border. This actually doesn't sound all that different from today, and sent back to likely persecution and death if there was perceived to be anything wrong with them. And of course, they just kept reducing care for everybody in the country. Now, at the same time this was happening, not everybody approved of these changes, and private philanthropy stepped in and began creating many of the services and organized charities we still know today. And they built institutions that were meant to care for persons with mental illness and mental retardation, unwed mothers, delinquent youth, orphans. This was part of a huge reform movement that, interestingly, at this time was often led in large part by women, often wealthy women who may not have even had the right to vote yet, but worked to change laws primarily by using the huge influence of their social circles and the people they knew in power. And they worked to change laws such as outlawing child labor, mandating certain minimal housing conditions, working conditions that were safer. And they began creating what we think of as human services. Often people think beginning with the settlement house movement in Chicago. And this meant bringing services right into the poor neighborhoods, not pulling people out of the neighborhoods who were having problems and needs, but going right into the neighborhood, living there and helping people in that neighborhood to move themselves out of poverty. They offered English classes, childcare, health care, job training, etc. So let's move into the 20th century. Major thing that happened was the Great Depression, which was an economic recession far larger than anything any of us have ever seen. In the 1930s, huge numbers of unemployment, businesses went bankrupt, banks collapsed, and people's life savings disappeared. There was homelessness, hunger, children were on the streets, and these were often people who had been working people, even middle-class people, so it got increasingly difficult to say it was their own fault. And the federal government, specifically President Franklin Roosevelt, announced that the government had to start taking care of people in need. It was the government's role. And under his administrations, we begin Social Security, unemployment insurance, what we think of as welfare, which was called relief. They created government-paid jobs in what was called the Works Programs Administration. The Civilian Conservation Corps took young men out of work on the streets and set them to work creating parks, forestry, building. And the major change was the total acknowledgement that government was responsible for the well-being of the people. So let's take a look from the 1960s to today. The institutions that had been built, particularly for the mentally ill and persons with developmental delays, had started with such good intentions to care for folks who couldn't care for themselves. They were going to be idealized places of comfort and security, education and training. But by the 60s, they had just turned into massive warehouses for people. Please pause here and I ask you to watch this video. It is very disturbing, but it says a great deal about what was happening in the 1960s. So, these institutions had started out with such good intentions. And what happened? Well, I think a few things happened. One is out of sight, out of mind. As people were put into, or even children and babies put into these institutions, nobody could see what was going on. They were forgotten. Families were encouraged to forget about them. And there was no oversight, no transparency. And often when people are aware that behind huge walls are people, they kind of figure they must be dangerous in some way, or why would they be behind walls? Most importantly, society didn't want to keep spending more and more money to provide the level of care that was intended. And people couldn't imagine any other alternative for people, so they just kept filling it up and filling them up. The rise of community-based programs happens at the same time. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson begins what was called the Great Society program. And in this period, we begin to see the formation of group homes for the disabled, community action programs, Head Start is formed, anti-poverty programs, job training, and a huge increase in community advocacy demanding as a right that there be these services. And then there was a big backlash by taxpayer groups, and they blamed the social services on what they thought of were their too high taxes. So they elected local and federal leaders who promised to cut services, cut their taxes by cutting services. And again, the social belief in blaming the poor, that they were poor because they didn't want to work. People had to take responsibility for themselves. The sick and evil myth of the, quote, welfare queen begins at this point as well. So there were large cuts in funding for building and maintaining affordable housing, for food stamps, childcare, job training, welfare cuts were all being cut at this point. Healthcare services were no longer considered something that was a priority for poor people. So now we're up to today, and how does society view people in need today? Well, how well do you think people today are being helped with their housing? Are being helped to have enough nutritious food, receiving adequate health care? In fact, do you think there are enough human services available and the right ones? And finally, going back to the big question, what role do you think, personally, that the government should play in helping people in need? And of course, how do you think these services should be paid for?